Today, we have an exciting author. My guest is Tanya Egan Gibson, and we will be talking about her newly released debut novel from Dutton Publishers, How to Buy a Love of Reading. Tanya was born and raised on Long Island, which is the scene of her book. She has a BA in English from Cornell University and an MA from the University of Washington. She's a former high school English teacher and began her novel while teaching. She and her family reside in Northern California. Her book, How to Buy a Love of Reading, is a literary gem with many levels. Tanya, welcome to my show.
Thank you so much.
Okay, let's get right to it. We have a lot to talk about. And I'd like to begin with your giving my listeners your overview of the story.
Okay, well, How to Buy a Love of Reading is set in a fictional suburb of Long Island called Fox Glen, and it's about a wealthy family who discover that their 16-year-old has announced at their private school that she's never read a book she liked. And they're very embarrassed because the appearance of intellectualism, the appearance of everything where they live is really important. So they decide to remedy it by commissioning an author to write a book that she has to like, written just for her, and they dub themselves the Medicis of Long Island.
Well, and that's a very interesting concept. Tell us what the inspiration was for your novel, which explains the title.
Well, I'm not sure that it quite explains the title, but the inspiration for it was that some years ago when I was teaching on the North Shore of Long Island, I had a kid who was really wonderful but really hated every single thing on my syllabus. And because I was a new teacher, I felt really eager to try to interest her in something. So I asked, what have you liked that you've read? And she said, no, it's not your fault. I'm sorry, Ms. Egan, I've just never read a book I liked.
Yes.
And I was a little bit stunned by that. And it stayed with me for a very long time that I would love to be able to write a book for somebody who hated reading, and that eventually ended up mutating into writing a book about somebody who's trying to write a book for somebody who doesn't like reading.
Yes. I'd like to talk a little bit about the structure of the book. I was struck by many things, but a clever tool that is also meaningful to the concept and important to the structure of the book that each chapter begins with a depiction of a party invitation. Begin by giving us your reason for doing it that way, having an invitation before each chapter.
That's a really good question. I really wanted the readers to feel like they were being invited into a world that was, I think, to most people so foreign. And in a lot of ways, it's a made-up world of my own head. And I wanted them to feel invited in, but yet at the same time feel like they were being told immediately that they were not part of it originally. Yes. Much as the author, Bree McEnroy, who is commissioned to write the book, feels that way every single weekend, because every single weekend there's a party, and she's brought into a situation that looks completely new to her, like a foreign land.
I also felt in reading the book, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I also felt like it was a very important tool for having all of these characters come together every week. And it was a good way of having the same people there all of the time. At least that's how I saw it as well. I saw it as the point that you made, but I thought, gee, that is a really good way to not to have to worry that all of the same characters are going to be there all of the time. So maybe there was a double meaning there that you didn't even think about at the time.
That is quite possible. And you're right, it is really hard to get a large cast of people, of young and old, into the same place. And so, yes, the parties definitely were a convenient way of getting them there. It also allowed me to sometimes, there are some scenes, parts of which are told in the omniscient, that kind of bounce around from different people's heads at the party. And to me, I feel like a party takes on a life of its own, And so I was able to, in those scenes, kind of show what all of these people en masse are thinking at the same time, because I do think that parties are kind of living, breathing things. They become these like giant organisms.
Right. Now, you use the term omniscient, and many of our listeners may not know what that means because it is a writer's term. So could you just explain that briefly?
Sure. The omniscient point of view is all-knowing, omni as in God. And so the omniscient narrator, instead of being confined to one person's head, can see everything, almost like a fly on the wall or God looking down from the sky.
Yes, and that's a rule of writing, too. We talk about the first person and so forth, and so I think that would explain to the listener that it gives the writer a broader scope as well. Now, before we go in deeper to the novel structure, tell us what the pretentious, wealthy North Shore inhabitants of this fictional town of Fox Glen you describe in your book are like.
They are mostly very insecure. They're not bad folks, but they often do some pretty bad things in the name of trying to help themselves, and mostly helping in the name of helping their children. And so they are so desperate to be able to make their children someone's and get them into the right schools that they often overlook what their children are actually intrinsically like. And that disconnect between what their parents want their children to be and what the children want to be ends up, in a lot of cases in this book, spawning some very unhappy children teenagers who partake in very destructive behavior.
And it's a very different world than the average person would be familiar with. On a personal note, one of the PR descriptions that I was sent talked about the fact that you were born and raised on Long Island's South Shore, and it was described as the eggless side of the island. Fitzgerald didn't write about. What does that mean, eggless?
Well, in The Great Gatsby, there are two eggs, and there's East Egg and West Egg, and those are two little kind of humps on Long Island.
Okay.
And the North Shore tends, for the most part, that part of the North Shore, at least, tends to be relatively affluent. I was brought up on the South Shore of Long Island in a middle class, lower middle class, working class kind of environment, and I actually did not somehow understand that the North Shore existed until many, many years later, until somehow after I had graduated college. Mm. So it was really interesting to me when I started working there, when I got a job there, to see that that this place that was a half an hour away was actually about a world away from what I had ever seen.
Yes, or the moon. And,
yes.
And I think, I think that's what happens to middle-class people in their lives. They're in a particular world, and one wouldn't know much about that other world. Today, everything is exposed on television and the internet, so we learn a little more about it, but normally in growing up, we don't.
That's true too. I forgot it. Well, it was a really different world then.
Mm-hmm. Yes. This is the Jacqueline Bachar Show, and I'm talking to novelist Tanya Egan Gibson about her first published book, How to Buy a Love of Reading. Tanya, let's get into now. I'd like to ask you to describe the main character, Carly Wells, a young and wealthy high school girl, and her relationship in the beginning of the book to her family and the community.
Carly is 57 pounds overweight, according to the personal trainer that her mother has her see a couple of times a week. And she's also disengaged intellectually from what's going on around her. And her mom is anorexic, and her best friend has an eating disorder. And Carly's not trying to lose weight. Carly is just being Carly. She has her closest friend is the golden boy of the neighborhood, Hunter, who is a year older, who's 17, and everybody loves. And so she's kind of this non-entity at the beginning because compared to everybody around her, she seems to have nothing special to her. But the truth is that she actually has a very active internal life. And that's something that ends up coming out about her as this book gets written for her by Bray, is that we learn that she actually has a lot going on inside her head. She's just not a show-off.
We don't want to give too much away, of course, about the story, but the beginning of the book I thought was really terrific. The description. Could you give a little bit of a description about that party that her parents were giving for Carly?
The one at the very beginning that Bunny's parents are giving, the Sweet 16, or Carly's parents?
Well, either one.
Okay. The book opens at a Sweet 16 for one of Carly's not-so-close friends, Bunny Gardner, and it's very lavish. Bunny's parents have decided that they want to make their child into a sculptor because they think it will look good on her college applications.
I thought that was hysterical.
Thank you. So they've given her a sculpture-themed Sweet 16, everything down to like the ice sculpture of the David, and the entire theme is sculpture. They're actually having all of her friends' heads sculpted next to the tables while people are eating, except that the plaster from the little sanders is getting in the air and it's ruining everybody's food. So it's very over the top. Everything about this place, which is hyperbolic. I don't think a place quite this crazy ever existed, but it's all these very over the top parties.
Well, at one time it did exist. I've read accounts of lavish parties like that, perhaps in Gatsby's day or another time. And there's still parties, I think, even in these hard times going on like that, but they're just not publicized as much. I mean, money is money, and they can do those things. Talk now about the party that her parents gave for her.
So Carly's parents give this party to celebrate the fact that they have become the Medicis of Long Island. So they want to show off Brie McEnroy, their author, like a possession. Carly's mother thinks of it as analogous to when somebody had bought a really nice piece of artwork and put it in their foyer. She decides that she's going to bring Brie into this very lavish party. The only problem is that people can't necessarily control each other, and so into this very lavish party where everyone is clad in Armani comes Brie McEnroy wearing pleather, which is plastic leather jeans, and combat boots.
All right, let's hold off on going into further description about that, because I do intend to get into that in a little further. So before we head to that point, I'd like to go back now to the structure of the book, because you touched on it briefly. There's so much depth to the novel. There's stories within stories, books within the book, television shows, and even advice on how to write a story. And at the same time, each section of the book is titled with a descriptive literary term, each part of the book. So I found this a book as much for a writer as for the reader. Could you briefly elaborate upon that idea?
It definitely, for me, it was a book about how to write a book and also how not to write a book.
Mm-hmm.
The literary terms that are mentioned are terms that come up in Carly's classroom with this kind of loopy English teacher she has, who gives these very strange literary terminology lessons, which, while they sound odd, are not always actually wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, they are also terms that Carly is thinking about when she is trying to direct Brie in writing the book that Carly is supposed to fall in love with. At the same time, Brie, the writer, is learning from Carly what doesn't work for Carly and what doesn't work for a lot of people in a book, including writers trying to be so writerly that they lose the reader completely. And so as it goes on, Brie starts learning about what Carly is saying maybe somebody really wants to read, which is not Brie showing off.
Can you talk a little bit about, you had mentioned Carly's best friend, who is Hunter K. I love the name Hunter. Can you talk a little bit about his fascination and love for F. Scott Fitzgerald and The Great Gatsby?
I would love to, because I kind of have a love for F. Scott Fitzgerald and The Great Gatsby myself. Mm-hmm. Hunter is this very good-looking young man who formerly was not such a good-looking young man before he came to Fox Glen. And he had this, he had just been this geeky bookworm who fell in love with books and became kind of a fan of authors his whole life. And then he was kind of reborn in this new place, Fox Glen, where he is very good-looking and very popular, but internally he is still the same bookworm kind of geek. As a model for what ends up being his self-destruction, because one of the ways he deals with not really being on the outside who he is on the inside is drinking a lot and developing a drug habit, he becomes entranced with F. Scott Fitzgerald, who died at age 46 of complications from alcoholism. I believe he actually had a heart attack. So he becomes just entranced with F. Scott Fitzgerald, and because he is living in a place where The Great Gatsby was set, many of Hunter's references are The Great Gatsby, and it's almost like he tries to excuse some of his own excesses by saying, well, this is what Fitzgerald did.
Well, as you also said earlier, he is Carly's best friend, and possibly, on the outside anyway, his only true friend. And he is charming, as you mentioned, but troubled. And he, against the advice of all of his social group, has this strange relationship with Carly. Can you talk a little bit about that relationship? Because he did obviously care for her, but he could also be very cruel.
I think that their relationship was really, really fun for me to write and revise a lot. Mm-hmm. They are platonic, but they cuddle. She stays over his house and plays house, but there's nothing actually sexual about their relationship. She always wants more than that. He doesn't seem to want more than that, but he can't back off from what they have either. So they're in this kind of in-between place where people keep on telling him, as a grown-up, you can't do this. You have to either, be friends with her or have something else. And he wants this in-between place. And she allows it for a very long time. She also allows him to be cruel to her, particularly when he's drunk. But part of her really believes that under that there's this person who can be what she hopes he's going to be, which to me is quintessentially, she's 15 turning 16, and to me there's that quintessential teen girl thing of thinking that if you just love someone enough that they could change. And that's where she is, at least at the beginning of the book with Hunter.
Well, and he didn't get what he needed from his mother, so there was I felt some psychological need there as well, that he was getting the cuddling from her, and she would take care of him and keep his secrets. He didn't want people to know when he was ill or when he was doing drugs, because he just didn't want them to know that. So it was quite it's also a more complex relationship than just two teens coming together, and a very important part of the book.
I think. I'm sorry.
No, go right ahead.
I was going to say I think that's a good point, because part of what I was thinking when I wrote it too was that Hunter, for Carly, he's not a substitute for her father. He's a substitute for her mother too.
Yes.
It's a very motherless book. And so there is a lot of that, of people turning to each other for nurture, because there is no sense of anything maternal going on with anyone who you would expect to be maternal.
I think this is a good point to describe Carly's parents. I got a kick out of the father in particular, but tell our audience what his line of work was that brought him all of these riches.
He is a bra magnate, a brassiere magnate. He invented the Marvel bra, which is, you could think of kind of like any kind of those push-up bra.
Uh-huh.
And he loves bras. He loves them so much that he has built a museum on the top floor of their mansion devoted to bras. And he was just from a good boy from Brooklyn with no money whatsoever before that. He still has a very heavy accent, and he's treated by the people around them as a little bit of a laughingstock because he is so overtly nouveau riche. But the truth is, despite the fact that he has some very silly things about him, he's actually a pretty nice guy. He makes some pretty poor decisions in the book, but he actually really does see that his daughter is not headed for a very good place, and he loves her for who she is, but for a long time he just thinks that he wouldn't know how to make things better for her, so he bows to what his wife thinks would make things better for Carly.
And the wife just wants to make herself look better, really. Everything that's going on is for appearances.
I'll tell you, though, I think Gretchen, and I think that this happens a lot, I think Gretchen really thinks that Carly would be happier if she were very thin, if she were very popular. And I think that this is one of those things where Gretchen, in her own mind, is not a bad guy. She really does think that this is the best thing for her daughter, even if the way that she tries to help her daughter looks ghastly to us on the outside.
Well, as all mothers do with their daughters, if they're have too much weight on them, they do try to help. So that was a very real point. Now, the two important characters that come into the story are Bree, as you mentioned, the writer commissioned to write Carly's book, and Justin, who is a famous reclusive writer who comes uninvited to the Wells estate. Tell us how these two not only help to pull the novel together, but are crucial to Carly's understanding of writing books and the stories that people make up. Elaborate on that a little bit.
Well, Bree has written one novel in the past that was published. It was very long, and nobody read it because it was writerly in a way that actually wasn't fun for anybody to read, plus very, very depressing. And Justin, who Bree was friends with in college, is known for writing these novels that everybody loves, that in the real world would be like Oprah picks. Mm-hmm. They're accessible and they're very, very emotional, and that's the opposite of what Bree writes. Bree writes these books that are very cerebral, and nobody really can actually care about. And so when they come together in Fox Glen, it gives Carly an opportunity to see the different angles that people come at about being a writer. And Justin, despite the fact that he is kind of reclusive and also messed up, as most people are in Fox Glen, keeps on encouraging this very emotional side of Carly, that this is okay, that this is an okay way of processing the world emotionally. It's the way that he writes, it's the way that he thinks that people should function. He believes that emotion is more important than words, and he doesn't care if people say he's not a wordsmith. So that's how these two writers function in the story, and they start to show Carly that you have choices about what you read and about what you write.
But he shows up at the at the party because he knows that Bree is there. Is that correct? That they have a past together.
They have a past, and I don't want to reveal too much about that because it becomes clear as the novel goes on what is actually going on here. But they do have a past, and she has always resented him because she knew on some level she felt like she was the better writer, but he got all these accolades for writing characters that she realizes are actually in part based upon who he thinks she is. Mm-hmm. He writes about these characters that come from lower middle class, working families who have to struggle, and he's very, very wealthy himself, and she realizes very early on that he is basing them all on her or who he thinks that she is, and she's very resentful of that because she feels like, he's co-opted her own past. She doesn't write about her, but now he's writing about her.
Yeah, she was rather annoying in the beginning.
She is a very bitter person at the beginning.
Yeah. And it seemed everything that she was doing was trying to sabotage herself. And we're talking a lot about writing technique and the layers of the story, but it's so important to the story. And I do want to assure my listeners, that the reader doesn't have to have inside information about any of this, since the novelist is highly readable. I think it would be interesting, though, for our listeners to know how long it took you to write this book.
I started the book in 1999, and it was published this May. So the writing of it probably was about 8 of those, 8 or 8.5 of those years. Publishing is a slow business. So
yes, it is.
I got an agent for it in 2006 in the fall. My agent, Susan, is wonderful. She had me rewrite the book twice.
Oh, my.
And it was sold to Dutton in very early 2008, and then it's about a year and a half later it came out.
But you did start it while you were still teaching, is that correct?
I actually did start it while I was still teaching. I was working on another novel earlier when I was teaching, and that one did not work out, but it was good practice for about 4 years or so.
Yes.
And then I started writing this one while I was teaching, about 5 years after the student actually said to me that she had never read a book she liked.
Mm-hmm. What I find interesting personally, both as a writer and as a reader, is the rhythm in the telling of this story that not only defines the actions that takes place, but becomes a part of Carly's emotional responses and understanding. I felt a sense of a definite rhythm in the emotions and things that were going on. And then, of course, we don't want to give the ending away, but it seems that almost a sense of resignation at the end of the book. The rhythm totally changed. Do you think consciously about the use of rhythm in your writings?
I do, and certainly in terms of sentences and paragraphs. I probably less overtly as far as that big picture structure, but I read aloud everything that I read, and rhythm to me in sentences is really important.
Yes.
So I'm a slow writer in the sense that I write something 10 times, 15 times. I revise and revise. Usually the right thing does not come to me until a lot of revision, and so rhythm comes into that a lot because I have to feel it, and I usually have music on in the background, and I have to feel the sentence feeling like it's coming to the correct end for the for what I want to convey.
Yeah, and it does create that sense of whatever is going on in the scene, whether it's something filled with tension or emotion or whatever. So I felt it. So
I'm glad. Thank you.
Yeah. So your use of rhythm was really terrific. Tell us a little bit about what you're going to be doing at our library appearance in January. Are you going to be reading from the book?
You know, I have to tell you the truth. I don't have very many details on it yet.
Okay, well,
I believe that I'm going to be reading from the book and then doing some Q&A, but
yes.
I can't swear to any of it yet.
Well, that's okay. Whatever you're going to be doing, we're certainly going to look forward to. Are you working on another book now?
I am. I am working on a book that is set at a theme park.
Oh, that sounds like fun.
It is. I've actually been doing a lot of research into how people imagineer these rides. You know, not just the simple roller coasters, but the ones that really tell a story. The way that for instance, rides at the Disney parks tell a story. Because to me, those rides are such an interesting interactive storytelling because you're bringing something to the story, and then not only are you watching and listening, but there's a whole kinetic element to it where you're moving through the story. So I'm pretty obsessed with the idea of storytelling, as anyone who reads this book can tell, and I'm trying to bring that a little bit to my theme park book.
Well, I'm going to look forward to that coming out when it does come out, and I hope you'll be back on my show.
Thank you.
And Tanya, we are out of time, so good luck on that. How to Buy a Love of Reading, of course, my listeners can find at their local bookstore. Thanks so much for being with us, and I'm looking forward to your coming back with your next book.